welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. My name is Grace Cowan. I'm one of the national officers of the Stop the War Coalition, and I will be chairing the meeting this evening. Trump's New World Disorder, which comes at an incredibly dangerous moment. In recent weeks, I'm sure we've all watched in horror as the American president boasts about his plans to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into a dystopian Trump Tower-lined Riviera. Trump's even shared an AI video yesterday parodying a Gaza emptied of Palestinians, replaced by Elon Musk and Benjamin Netanyahu partying. We've all witnessed the cowardly silence also and shameful complicity of our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, for refusing to condemn Trump's plans whilst continuing to arm Israel. Ahead of his meeting with the president, Starmer is doing his best, clearly, to impress by hiking defense spending at the expense of foreign aid and our public services. Once again, our political leaders are taking us for fools, expecting us to believe that Russian forces, who could not even reach Kiev, pose an existential threat not only to Berlin, but to London too. We must not allow Starmer to use Trump's chaos as a pretext to ramp up militarism and further decimate our public realm. So we're delighted to be here this evening and to be joined by 5 brilliant speakers tonight to discuss this new world disorder and how the anti-war movement in Britain can and must organise in these conditions. So without further ado, let's move on to the first of these brilliant speakers. He is the legendary writer, broadcaster, anti-war activist, and longtime friend of Stop the War. It's a real honour to have him here this evening. Over to you, Tariq Ali.
Thank you, Grace, and greetings, everyone. I think that what we are witnessing is not a big shift in foreign policy, but an expression of totally crude and open war aims and imperial aims by the current government. Previous presidents, all of them, who've pushed through these wars, supported them, backed Israel, armed it, are partially responsible for the mess that the United States is in and what is going to happen to other countries on the flight path of American power. I mean, people say, how could Trump get elected? And my response to that is Trump could get elected because Biden was utterly pathetic. We cannot spare the Democrats in this. They're responsible. They kept to their, half-dead president. They had a bad choice of replacing him. They refused to allow Democrats to choose their own nominee, which could have been produced a different situation. So the political class that runs the United States is to blame collectively. Trump is doing what he said he would do. He's doing a deal with Putin on the Ukraine war. It seems no one thought he would. Many thought he would renege, but he's not. So that war is going to be over, I hope soon. And what the terms are, we shall see. Clearly, they're not going to be in benefit of the Ukrainian masses who have suffered this war, which could have been brought to an end through negotiations, as we argued for a long, long time in Stop the War. And our meetings were not allowed. Our meetings, people, withdrew from our platforms, withdrew their signatures. Why? Because we were too critical of NATO, or saying that, one had to see the war in all its different aspects. So Zelensky is no longer beatified. He's not going to get too many more standing ovations in the Senate or the House of Commons, and we will see what comes out of this. Now, in my opinion, on Gaza, we're, all in agreement. all of us in different ways and millions of others have been waging a campaign. I'll just come to that in a minute. But how to explain this open assault on, what the US in most cases is regarded as their values. The ethnic cleansing, the expulsion of 1.5 million Gazans in the Middle East it's their words really fail us. It's outrageous. And what is equally outrageous is that all the Arab governments, or most of them, are going to go along with this. And the Palestinian Authority is already collaborating in imprisoning Palestinians. There's some shocking material being circulated. So it's a grim situation in the Middle East. Why are they doing this? In my opinion, the United States has decided, or is in the process of deciding, how to tackle China. So a lot of what they're doing is linked to the aim to get China, and the Russian démarche likewise. Do a deal with Putin, hopefully neutralize him in any further conflict, maybe even get him on side, isolate the Chinese and isolate the Iranians. The Iranians have to be isolated because they're on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. That is what the common talk is. And a deal done, which Israel is opposing behind the scenes. So to stop Iran selling its oil directly to China and Russia, but basically going through the United States and getting its approval before they do it, is part of the process of isolating China. Whether it succeeds or not is a different question, but I think we have to understand that this is what they're up to, that the economic rise of China has completely jolted them. Why, I don't know, because it's been obvious for the last 10 years, has been that this is what is going on. China is now has shifted the capital of the world market eastwards and is supplying the bulk of the world with consumer goods, quite similar in some ways to the British Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But it has not challenged the US militarily. Its own policy is largely, its military foreign policy is based on self-defense. So are they going to use Hong Kong and Taiwan to provoke China into a conflict? We shall see. All these things are being discussed. The one point worth making, which the imperial leaders in Washington, regardless of which party they belong to or represent, cannot understand, is that it is very difficult to keep a people in sort of semi-slave conditions forever, that sooner or later there are uprisings, and these uprisings take people by surprise by their timing. And so fact is, as we know, the supporters and Hamas itself has not been defeated. We saw over 1 million people marching behind Nasrallah's cortege. I mean, hugely impressive. Who are these people? They're ordinary people. They're not going to be defeated just like that. They may be put down, they may be repressed, they may be ethnically cleansed, but they're there because it's their country and it's their part of the world, and there are limits to how long they can be occupied. And I hope the Zionist leadership understands this, that it is not over. It may be they may have won temporary victories, but it's not something that can be kept down. So, in terms of what to do, we have to carry on what we are doing, exposing the lies. I mean, people doing it in the States like Medea have been incredibly courageous. We have seen confronting senators, confronting congressmen, confronting crooks of every sort who are involved in this. One last point I'll make, and then I'll stop, Grace, is this, that when the American vice president, kooky though he is, said recently that democracy is under threat in Europe, I mean, people went berserk, especially in Germany. But I mean, it is true. I mean, the harassment now being inflicted on German citizens who want to protest against the war in Gaza, the pathetic harassment that is going on in this country, trying to intimidate demonstrators. Why? I mean, this too marks what this Labour government has actually become, is a government that is destroying all its past, breaking with the good sides of Labour policies in the past on civil liberties, on defending old people, on defending the young. That's all going. This is a party which could belong and shift anywhere. And I saw in the German election results that the Die Linke did completely well, won Berlin. I mean, won the most seats in the capital of Germany. And so we have to think creatively, not as stop the war, but as, political activists and socialists about how to operate in this country where we have no alternative at all. So while things are bad in terms of temporary gains for the American-Israeli nexus, the fight with Europe, we don't know how that will end. I think Europe will cave in, as it always does, to the US. And Starmer's sort of boastful things of we're taking British troops there will come to an end that they deserve. So, we fight on.
Thank you so much, Tariq. It's always an honor to listen to you speak, and thank you for ending on that. We fight on, which, yes, we certainly will. Our next speaker is joining us tonight from the belly of the beast. She is an American. She co-founded the women's peace organization Code Pink, and she has had a long time relationship with Stop the War Coalition since way back in 2002, when she played a pivotal role in helping to organize the historic Global Day of Action against the Iraq War on February the 15th, 2003. She is an absolute legend. As Tariq just said, if you've ever seen a video of an American war criminal being interrupted, from Donald Rumsfeld to Antony Blinken and Nancy Pelosi, she's called them all out. I am delighted that she could be here with us today to set the scene from the States. Over to you, Medea Benjamin.
Well, thank you so much. It's always an honor to be with Stop the War Coalition. I just ran back from Congress, where we are every single day trying to hold these horrible people accountable who have no interest in representing the US people, but represent the lobbyists who put them in power. It's incredible to think it's only been a month since Trump is in power, because it's just been a whirlwind. And if I am a bit random in my talk, it's because we're going in so many different directions here. I mean, just imagine the first week where he talked about buying Greenland, making Canada the 51st state, taking back the making Canada the 51st state, taking back the Panama Canal, renaming the Gulf of Mexico. And all of this anti-immigrant horror, that there is this invasion of immigrants. This all happened in the first week. It makes us think that we're back to the 1900 Manifest Destiny on steroids, where the US can go not only to its backyard in Latin America, but anywhere in the world and steal its resources. But there are so many contradictions. Sometimes Trump says and does things we like. So the talking with Russia is absolutely fantastic, and we're excited about the possibility of ending that war. But of course, we're concerned about this deal of stealing their minerals. And while we want to weaken NATO, we are concerned about this push for the NATO countries to spend more and more of their money on the military. We think that talking about China and Russia coming together to do new arms deals and cut the militaries by 50% is music to our ears. But what is happening in reality is that the Republican Party is adding $150 billion more to the Pentagon budget. And while we have this new organization by Elon Musk's Doge that is going around destroying all of these different government entities, it's been tiptoeing very gently when it comes to the biggest pot of money, which is the Pentagon. And in so far, at least, just talking about very small things like the waste of money on things that are like gender equity, instead of going after things like the F-35. We also were told that the Pentagon was going to be asked to cut its budget by 8%, but it turned out that that was a ruse, that they're asking different departments in the Pentagon in different areas to cut by 8% so that that 8% could then be used to focus on how do we beat China. Definitely a very, very anti-China sentiment. In terms of the Middle East, well, we heard from Tariq and you, Grace, when we started about this disgusting video that just came out, but it's sort of the empire in its most raw form, showing the absolute disregard and disgust. And we are ashamed that our president would put something out like that. But we've seen him giving everything to Netanyahu, just like the Democrats did. We see the Republicans sanctioning the International Criminal Court, ready to give a green light to Israel's takeover of the West Bank. In fact, there's a piece of legislation saying that you can't even call it the West Bank anymore. It has to be Judea and Samaria. And this absurdity of owning Gaza. We also are concerned about the alliances that the Trump administration is making with the right wing all over the world. We know the alliances they're making with the right wing in Germany, for example, and in Hungary, but this is very much in Latin America as well. In the conservative group that got together this last weekend, they had the president of Argentina there, Milei. They had the old horrible dictator from Brazil, Bolsonaro, there. So really forming this global network of right-wing extremist groups around the world. You might have heard about the gutting of the Agency of International Development, AID, which is so contradictory because many of us have hated so many of the programs of AID over the years, seeing it being used as a front for the CIA, being used for regime change. But on the other hand, there are AID programs that have been sending food to hungry people, have been sending medicines to people to treat them with HIV, AIDS. But we don't know once they gut these agencies, how they will build them back. And of course, we're worried that the building back will be to support these right-wing groups around the world. I have to talk about the domestic front because it's been so wild. I mean, here you have Elon Musk, who's now become the most important person in the United States, and the wealthiest person in the world, the person who gave more money than anybody ever has in the history of the US to a presidential campaign, $270 million to get Trump elected. And he has contracts with the US government, especially the Pentagon, that are in the billions and billions and billions of dollars. So terrible conflicts of interest. And meanwhile, he is going around laying off massive numbers of federal workers, and gutting entire departments from the Department of Education, the Consumer Finance Protection Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, and many fear that they are going to end up cutting Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps to be able to pass a $1 trillion tax cut to the rich. So the protests are growing every single day here in the United States. Many of them are Democratic Party protests, which makes us a little reluctant to get 100% behind. But many of them are also union protests, particularly the American Federation of Government Employees and other unions that are representing these workers that are being laid off. And there is a lot of anger with against the Democratic Party itself for letting this all happen and not doing enough to stop it. I've gone to a number of these protests, and you hear spontaneous chants coming from the crowd when the Democratic representatives are actually speaking, and the crowd is saying, "Do your effing job. Do your effing job. You should be doing something to stop these Republicans. What are you doing?" And there is anger with the Republicans building up in many of the districts. And these are places now that Bernie Sanders is going to. He's going to swing Republican districts in the heartland of the United States, where he's finding a lot of people who identify either as Democrats or Republicans, but are getting very angry at this wholesale destruction of a lot of important government agencies and taking away of people's jobs, and worry about them taking away the little safety net that we have. So Bernie Sanders is getting large crowds, and it's quite amazing. This 83-year-old is going on a tour called Fighting Oligarchy. But we are glad that he is out there building up the opposition. We also have some young, important people in the Congress, like the new head of the Progressive Caucus, which is one of the largest caucuses in Congress, a congressman named Greg Casar, who is only 35 years old and has a lot of good fighting spirit, especially when it comes to the immigration issue. And we also have some relief that's coming from the courts and stopping some of the worst things that the Trump administration is doing, at least temporarily. Where we see the fight coming is against the crackdown on immigrants. But I must say that the immigrant population is really fearful to come out on the streets. In the past, we have had immigrant marches that have gotten a million people out on the streets in places like Los Angeles. Now it's very hard to get numbers anywhere near that because people are so afraid of being swept up during these demonstrations. When it comes to Gaza, the demonstrations here are getting smaller, unfortunately. We look in awe at the demonstrations in the UK and say, why can't we get people out like that? And we know that there's crackdown in the UK as well, so I'm not saying it's an excuse, but people are very fearful here in the United States. Lots of them have been losing their jobs. The students have been expelled from their campuses. Organizations like ours are being sued in lawsuits, and there is a lot of push to be investigating our organizations for our, quote, links to Hamas. So part of the reason is the fear. There are many other factors, no time to get into them, but we are trying hard to rebuild. In fact, this week there will be a week-long encampment at the Embassy of Israel that will hopefully get a lot of support and a lot of energy. So in closing, I would say that our hopefulness comes from two places. One is that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are going too far when it comes to the domestic slash and burn that they are doing. And as I mentioned, there are daily protests. In fact, the slogan is a protest a day keeps the fascists away. And these protests are happening every day and growing. On the international front, I think there's also the sense that Trump has gone too far when it comes to the sanctions, when it comes to the tariffs, not only on China, but also on our allies of Canada and Mexico. And we're hoping that the Arab countries will come up with some alternative to his ethnic cleansing, disgusting idea of owning Gaza and turning it to the resort on the Riviera. And I think I will end as Tariq did, which is to say that we fight on, and we look forward to fighting as we move forward with our friends overseas, especially you in the UK. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Medea. Thank you very much for running over from Congress to join us. We really appreciate it. Was that a protest a day keeps the fascists away? It certainly has a ring to it. Solidarity from all of us over here with everything that you're doing. I hope the week-long encampment at the Israeli embassy goes well. We're with you in your struggle, and I personally look forward to seeing the next video of you of whatever you do next, Medea.
Excellent. Thank you.
Straight over to our next speaker now. He is a Stop the War national officer and former president of the RMT. It's over to you, Alex Gordon.
Well, thank you, Grace, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to this meeting tonight. It's very appropriate that we're having this Stop the War webinar this evening at this very moment, just as our Prime Minister Keir Starmer has arrived at the White House to kiss the ring of Donald Trump. Trump's approach to international relations is, of course, in the style of a New York real estate mafia mogul. His offer to buy Greenland from Denmark, to annex Canada as the 51st state of the USA, to rename the Gulf of Mexico, to take over the Panama Canal from Panama, and to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians in order to build condominiums and golf courses. But what does Keir Starmer, the former human rights lawyer, have to offer Trump beyond shortbread and flattery? Well, this week we heard Starmer pledge to scrap 40% of UK overseas aid to pay for an increase in UK military expenditure from 2.3 to 2.5% of UK gross domestic product. That's worth about £6 billion a year, in addition to the current enormous arms budget. But this direct bribe, which is what it amounts to US arms companies who dominate the military industrial supply chains of all the NATO countries, including our own, is unlikely to be enough to impress the Donald. Starmer has promised more to Trump, including that UK military spending will increase to 3% of GDP in the next term of a Labour government. And the only arguments coming from the main parliamentary opposition parties here in Britain, of course, is that Starmer isn't raising military spending fast enough or far enough. The Liberal Democrats want 3% now and for the UK to join a European army. Where have we heard that one before? The level of arms spending pledges in this country from leading politicians is already becoming inflated like a classic stock market exchange bubble. On the 6th of January this year, the UK Defence Secretary, John Healey, announced additional military spending in 2025 to 2026, this financial year, of £3 billion for the AUKUS nuclear submarine project, the Australia, UK, United States joint project to build nuclear submarines for deployment in the Asia Pacific, and for the UK nuclear strike force. And John Healey boasted in Parliament to MPs, the UK has for many years been one of the highest spenders on defence in NATO. We continue to hold that proud record. Increasing spending this year will mean that Britain continues to be one of the highest spenders in NATO. This is what they're boasting about in Parliament to our faces. And later the same month, John Healey announced a further £9 billion arms contract to Rolls-Royce. On the 16th of January this year, just 4 days before Donald Trump was inaugurated in Washington, DC, Keir Starmer flew to Kiev to sign a 100-year partnership between the UK and Ukraine, which, according to the UK government's own website, quote, cements the UK as a preferred partner for Ukraine's energy sector, critical mineral strategy, and steel production. So probably the real conversation happening now between Trump and Starmer in the White House this evening will at least partly concern whose real estate deal takes precedence. Starmer's on the 16th of January or Trump's on the 26th of February. And you don't need to be a very forensic human rights lawyer to know whose deal will prevail. US imperialism will prevail, and the UK Prime Minister will smile and suck it up, knowing that the role of a junior partner in US imperialism is the very best that he can aspire to. The Ukrainian Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, confirmed this week that Ukraine and the US have now reached a preliminary agreement on a broad economic deal that includes US access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals during its war with Russia. After several days of negotiations, Ukraine and the United States will sign this preliminary agreement, but with further details of a full agreement, which may include security guarantees, yet to be worked out. President Zelensky, Ukraine's president, has said he's now ready to sign a framework economic deal with the US, even without security guarantees, and he's due in Washington tomorrow for wide-ranging substantive talks with Donald Trump. And Zelensky has said that the main topics that he wants to discuss with Trump are whether the US plans to halt military aid to Ukraine, and if so, whether Ukraine would be able to purchase weapons directly from the US. He also wants to know whether Ukraine will be able to use frozen Russian assets for weapons investments, and whether Washington plans to lift its sanctions on Russia. Mr. Trump has said that this is a big deal that could be worth $1 trillion. The draft reportedly doesn't actually include the contentious US proposals to give around about 500 billion, $500 billion US worth of profits from Ukraine's rare earth minerals as compensation for its wartime assistance to Kiev. Instead, the US and Ukraine are going to have joint ownership of a fund, and Ukraine in future would have to contribute 50% of all future proceeds from its state-owned resources, including all of its minerals, all of its oil, and all of its gas reserves. Now, ordinary people in Britain, observing our Prime Minister negotiating to carve up Ukraine's mineral wealth with the most powerful man in the world in the White House this evening, can increasingly see through the war fever talk that has emanated without any interruption or hardly any contrary views being allowed to be heard on mass media outlets in Britain. So that's why we need our own media, such as the Morning Star newspaper and great independent journalists like Matt Kennard. We know that Starmer's Chancellor Rachel Reeves has said that the fiscal rules that she's laid out in her budget are non-negotiable. Her new spending review, which is coming up next month, is predicted to commit government departments to cuts amounting to 5% of their budgets. So the political choice to cut spending on education, housing, health, social care, local government, and other essential public services, while massively boosting public expenditure on research, procurement, production, and sale of weapons of war, is a direct attack on our welfare to benefit the bottom line of mainly US and UK arms manufacturers. Stop the War Coalition this month at our annual general meeting recommitted to resist increases in military spending put forward in 2025 in the government's forthcoming strategic defence review, to demand a real peace dividend now by working with anti-poverty and anti-austerity campaigners for the £3 billion worth of additional nuclear military spend that was announced this year to be restored to fund essential social needs, to scrap AUKUS, which is extending nuclear proliferation in the Asia Pacific, and to work with peace campaigners in Australasia, Asia, and America to expose and oppose AUKUS, and to continue to call for Britain to leave NATO, which is an expansionist, imperialist alliance, and to prioritise instead public spending on welfare, not warfare. So despite all the attempts to intimidate and bully our mass peaceful protests, we will continue to demonstrate for Palestine, for Gaza, and for an end to militarism in Britain and the world. Join us at the next national demonstration for Palestine on Saturday, the 15th of March in central London to say freedom for Palestine, no to ethnic cleansing, stop arming Israel. Thanks very much, Grace.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you. That was a very, very informative contribution. Very powerful. Thank you. Alex has also drafted a model motion for us about arms spending for you to put around your local trade union branches that should be available on our website within the next day or so. It's just currently being put on there. So look out for that in our newsletter tomorrow. Our next speaker tonight is Matt Kennard. You don't need me to say it. You all know that Matt has been one of the loudest voices in Britain for Gaza over the past 16 months. He is a leading independent investigative journalist. He was previously the head of investigations at the investigative journalism website Declassified UK, which he co-founded. And he is the author of a number of brilliant books, including The Racket, which is currently on its second edition. I would urge all of you to get a copy if you haven't already. We are absolutely delighted that he could be here with us this evening. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Grace. And thanks for having me at this important event. I would just say, in the context of what everyone's been saying and in the context of what we're seeing, Stop the War Coalition has never been more important, which is why it comes under such attack. There's a correlation between those two things. In terms of independent anti-war groups, no group has had the same impact as Stop the War since 2003, when it organised the biggest demonstration in UK history. So it's great to be here, and also great to be a patron now. But yeah, the topic today is obviously a huge one, as Medea said, because Trump has announced a rupture with the old order. Whether you like that rupture or not, it's undoubtedly a new world now. And to be honest with you, I think there's obviously many dangers with that, but there's also opportunities for the anti-war movement and for the left. And I'll start with that, because one particularly interesting part of this sort of Trumpian revolution in terms of foreign policy was the defunding of US aid and the National Endowment for Democracy now, which are two institutions which I've done a lot of work on in the past. And what it seems he's doing is just getting rid of liberal imperialism, or getting rid of the imperialism that America practiced behind a whole sheet of propaganda. Since the Second World War, when they took over the imperial mantle from the UK, the US has dressed its imperial system up in nice, fusty language about human rights, democracy, aid, all these wonderful things that they bring to the world. And it's actually much harder to fight that type of imperialism, because it's a propaganda that's repeated all through the mainstream. And it's a propaganda which is believed by large sections of not just the population within the United States, but around the world. And Trump is basically saying, look, I want to practice imperialism proudly. I don't need to hide behind all this bullshit that we fed to the world, like the fact that US aid spreads is a transfer of wealth to the world's poor, which is not true, or National Endowment for Democracy is about promoting peace. So for me, that, yeah, as I said, that's an opportunity for us, because it's much more blatant now, the US role in the world. And actually, it's going to make it harder for the US to impose its power around the world without institutions like USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, because they're key parts of the imperial tapestry. They're key parts of the soft power role of the United States. And in fact, it's not even just soft power, because if you talk about USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, I've done quite a lot of work on those institutions in places like Bolivia, and they actively fund opposition to socialist governments. For example, under Evo Morales, I did a whole investigation of how both those institutions were funding that. Now they've disappeared. That doesn't mean that Trump is now going to leave those independent socialist governments alone in places like Venezuela, Bolivia, or Cuba. But it does mean that the type of imperialism that the US has always practiced is now going to be much more obvious. So they're going to do it through much more blunt forms, military intelligence. So there's that. The other thing that I think about his program is that he is trying to obviously mend relations with Putin's Russia, and you're seeing that in Ukraine, and obviously that should be something that's welcomed by the anti-war movement, because that's a conflict that has gone on for years now, and in my opinion is just a meat grinder for the Ukrainian troops. Now, Putin's invasion in 2022 was illegal, and so was the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, but there's absolutely no way that Putin is going to give back Crimea or the Donbass. It's just not going to happen. He'd set off a nuke before he did those things. So in that context, how do we go forward? And the answer isn't to keep fighting for years and years and years. The answer is to come to some kind of deal where we can save some lives. There's been too many people have died already. And actually the main reason, or one of the main reasons why that hasn't happened already, is because of the control of the arms industry over our discourse. Now, the arms industry funds many think tanks in the United States and Britain who put out research and have experts which are quoted in the press who always say, oh, we need to carry on fighting Putin. And why do they say that? They're saying that because that pumps up the bottom line of the arms companies. And it's a revelation to a lot of people, but the policy making in the UK and the US, a lot of it is, in terms of foreign policy, a lot of it is down to arms companies. And in fact, Robin Cook wrote in his memoirs that BAE Systems, which is the largest UK arms company, has the keys to the back door of number 10, and that's pretty much true. So there's also that side of it. But I think he's winding down Ukraine and getting close to Putin because his real goal is to attack, or at least further the war against China, which has already started. Because China, in terms of the threats to US hegemony, is by far the most acute. It's going to have the largest economy in the world in, as some people say, 10 to 15 years. It owns a lot of US debt, and it's has a much more rational economic policy than the United States itself. So Trump is basically just trying to move imperial. I mean, Obama did it during his what was called the pivot to Asia, but I think Trump is taking that to the nth degree. And also the other thing that I think Trump and maybe people around him have said is that it was a huge error on the part of Western militarists and imperialists to actually push Putin and China together, or Russia and China together. There was one stage where the West was actually quite open to China. And in fact, George Osborne and David Cameron's government, the coalition government, the first one, was really worked hard to get close to China. That all changed around the time of COVID, and China became an official enemy. And now there was obviously a deal signed between Xi and Putin about a year ago. But I think Trump wants to reverse that and wants to cleave those two powers away from each other. But and the other part of his program, I think, is going to be an attack on Iran. I think that's going to happen, and I think that's again why the Stop the War coalition is so important, because the neoconservatives in Washington have been wanting to, and obviously the Israelis as well, have been wanting to attack Iran since the 1990s, and they haven't been able to do it. Or they've been doing assassinations within Iran. There's been a covert war. There's been massive electronic warfare as well against Iran, but they haven't gone to a all-out regime change war. And I think part of that was because of the opposition to the Iraq War, which was in the UK and US in 2003. I think the idea was to go on to Iran. But I think now Netanyahu knows that he's got one term of Trump left because he can't run again after this. And they want to get the Iranian, what they call the Iranian threat, when they are the threat themselves, but they call it the Iranian threat. They want to get it out of the way. And if you look at the rhetoric of the Israeli leaders, they're always talking about the Houthis and Hezbollah as tentacles, but the octopus head is in Tehran. So they're priming the population for an attack on Iran. So, and I think Trump is open to that and will do that. So, yeah, it's a very scary world. I mean, and also it's a monster. He's a monster in a way that is unprecedented, really. I don't know if everyone has seen the AI video that he posted to his Instagram account yesterday of supposed Trump Gaza, with him and Netanyahu sunbathing on the beach in Gaza with cocktails. And it was it's a horrific to think that the most powerful man in the world, the man who oversees the most powerful empire in history, would post something like that is so dehumanizing and racist. But that's where we are. And I think that we're entering a new stage where this kind of blunt imperialism, this overt racism, is normalized, and actually the way they're going to deal with opposition to that domestically is to increase repression, and that's what we're seeing in the United States and the UK, particularly actually around Palestine. If you Tariq mentioned the assault on journalists and activists in the UK who are pro-Palestinian or against the genocide in Gaza, and obviously Chris Nineham of Stop the War was arrested and charged the other day. I think there's two sides to that. One is obviously it's hugely worrying because these are not freedoms that they give back once they've broken through the barrier of normalizing the arresting protesters or arresting journalists and radio. They'll keep doing it. They won't put it back in the box. But the good side of that, or not the good side, but the more positive side of that, is that they're doing it because they have lost control of the narrative. I've never seen the establishment in Britain, and I think to a degree in the United States, lose control of any narrative like they have over Gaza, because people have been able to see the pure horror that's been unleashed on the people of Gaza for 16 months, and despite the best efforts of the mainstream media to propagandize the public to justify it, they haven't bought it because they're consuming this information on social media. So if we can win the narrative war on Gaza, we can win the narrative war on other stuff. And obviously Gaza is related to the bigger issue, which is the US empire. This is the guiding dynamic which governs international affairs in our world, the overwhelming power of the United States. And Trump is making it much easier for us to get actually the liberal establishment, which has always been sort of the main intellectual powerhouse of the US empire, to bring them over to our side to say, look, this is what the US empire is. Trump is actually just an expression of it. He's a more blunt expression. And I think that's happening now. And I think we need to, we have a responsibility. I'll finish with this because I think I'm going over time, but I'll finish with this. Like, I've been reading a book recently, which is a history of the Third Reich. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's by an American journalist who actually was living in Germany during the 1930s. And it's quite sinister reading that, because the parallels with the world we're living in now are just legion. And the one thing that comes across in that book is that it wasn't inevitable. Hitler's rise to power wasn't inevitable. The left made a lot of mistakes. The left failed to organize. The left failed to really strategize to how to defeat fascism. And we're in that incipient stage now. And it's not even that incipient. You have Trump in the White House. You have people like Milei in Argentina, far right leader in Romania just won an election. If we have a historical duty as the left, as the anti-war movement, to step up now and organize and actually create political institutions, I believe, to really stop the sweep of fascism, which is on the rise and won't stop unless it's fought. That's the thing about fascism. It doesn't just go back into its hole. It has to be fought. And with Trump in the White House, you have someone who maybe isn't a fascist, but I actually think he's not political enough to be a fascist, but he would be a fascist if it was in his interests, and often it is in his interest now in this administration. So with him in the White House, that is spreading across the world, and we need to combat it. We need to combat the far right networks which put people like him and Javier Milei into power. And I'll finish with this: us in the UK have a big responsibility as well, because we are, although we're not America, we're a major part of the American empire. We're a major part of the imperial system, and we can affect our government and stop it spreading war and fascism around the world. So, and we should be doing that.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's always so incredible to hear you speak, and thank you for everything that you do. It goes without saying that it's never been more important to have independent journalists like yourself. Also, as Matt mentioned at our AGM that took place last month, we are honoured that Matt became a patron of Stop the War. So a massive thank you again, Matt. I'm going to move on now to our final speaker. She needs no introduction. She's the convener of Stop the War Coalition and has been leading the anti-war movement here in Britain for decades. Over to you, Lindsay German.
Thanks very much, Grace, and thanks to all the previous speakers on the panel who've contributed so many important and valuable points. And I think, I forget which one made this point, but of course we're at the beginning of this process with Trump. I mean, it's his second term, but I think we're all aware the second term is very different from the first term, bad though what that was. And there are all sorts of things that we can debate and discuss. And obviously there are many aspects to Trump's policies, and thanks to Medea in particular for joining us about what some of those are. I mean, I was pretty horrified this morning to wake up to the news that Andrew Tate had been allowed to leave Romania and go, obviously under pressure from the United States government, to go to Florida. And I think this tells you the sort of signals you're getting are signals which are really quite disgusting in terms of the sorts of things that Trump is endorsing, whether it's Musk and Bannon with the fascist salutes that aren't fascist salutes, or whether it's Tate or whatever it is, the AI thing that people are talking about from yesterday. All of this tells you a really, really horrible prospect for politics in many ways. And in a way, what Trump is saying about foreign policy, which is obviously mainly what we're talking about tonight, is it's not that he didn't say some of these things before he was elected, but I think that the way in which he's moved since he was elected and since he became president has been very dramatic, both in terms of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, where he's made it absolutely clear what his position is, but also 40,000 people have been driven out of the West Bank in the last week. And these are things that he completely supports. He completely supports Netanyahu. But I wanted to talk perhaps more about the relationship with Europe, because it seems to me that there we are facing a real turning point. And I think you can say in a way that Trump has kind of torn up much of what people expected from the post-war order, which was that the Western powers in Europe would be aligned with the United States, particularly Britain, but other powers as well, and that they would march in lockstep over particular policies. Now, Trump has torn that up with his decision to directly engage with Russia in talks, and to do so in a way which, at least initially, has excluded the other European powers and has excluded Ukraine as well. And he did that obviously because he said before he got elected that he wanted to get a peace deal over the Ukraine war. Now, whatever we think of what is happening with that, whether that peace deal will happen or what nature it will be and how brutal it will be, because it will be, we can see with Trump's desire to seize the mineral wealth of Ukraine exactly what's going on in his mind. And it isn't about peace and prosperity for the Ukrainian people, or indeed the Russian people, because that's the last thing on his agenda. But what he has done by doing it is really to expose a lot of lies that we've been told in Britain and the United States about the war in Ukraine. The idea that it was being won by the Ukrainians, the idea that if only we just kept sending more arms, that this would be a war which was victorious, the idea that Zelensky was massively popular and would get support from the Ukrainians. None of these things have been true for a long time. And one of the things that Trump did was to expose those. And that has led to a major crisis in European politics. And I think that if you look at what's happening, you can see exactly what Trump wants to do. He wants to try to get Russia on side in order to be clearer about being able to at least attack China, not militarily at this stage, but at some point in the future this will be talked about, but he wants China to be mainly in his sights as the main enemy of the United States, and he wants to get Russia into a place where it isn't necessarily aligned too closely with China. He also wants to give Netanyahu a completely free rein, and I agree with Matt that actually one of the main aims in the Middle East is that he will want regime change in Iran, and these are all things that we have to deal with over the next few months. But there's also the question of his claim that he's not going to fund so-called European defense anymore. Now, I think we need to unpick this a little bit, because the Trump supporters are now saying, oh yes, the Europeans have suckered the Americans for decades and made them pay for their defense and done all these kind of things. And I think if you just look at very brief history since 1945, the Americans had bases and do have bases in Europe for one simple reason, that they wanted to have bases in Europe, and they will not give up all the military control that they have in Europe. What they want to do is shift the cost of the military, and this has become very acute with the war in Ukraine, because it has involved big increase in so-called defense spending across Europe. They want to shift that burden onto the European powers, and particularly Germany. And what the result of this is fairly catastrophic, because what you have in Germany is a doubling of military and arms spending. You've got a situation where the whole war in Ukraine and the whole political situation there is perhaps the biggest crisis for German capitalism probably since the Second World War, and one in which that we now have the far right party, the AfD, which came second in the election. And it's my belief that this pressure on German working class people to pay for, in the words of Bismarck, guns rather than butter, will be a situation which will help to fuel the growth of the far right. So very, very dangerous situation there. Then we come to Britain, which is, we have in Keir Starmer, a Labour Prime Minister who is determined to appease Trump, which is what he is doing, but also at the same time who wants to be able to put himself into a Churchillian pose and pretend that he is going to be the last defender of Europe against the Russians. Now, this requires, again, a complete sort of suspension of any reality, because despite what is said, Russia is not about to invade Britain or anywhere else in Europe. That's just simply absolutely obvious. But in the course of this, what they're doing is saying there's this huge threat. The most important thing that Britain can do is to defend its borders. The most important thing it can do is be part of a European defense against Russia, and that this requires a big increase in arms spending. And the speech that Starmer made on Tuesday, just before he went to Washington, obviously it was designed exactly to appease Donald Trump rather than to do anything else, was to say that defense spending as a proportion of GDP is going to rise to 2.5 or 2.6% of GDP in 2 years' time, and that it will be 3% by the end of this parliament, and that it will be paid for by a 40% cut in overseas aid. Now, that 40% cut in overseas aid hits some of the poorest people in the world, hits people already engaged in wars and in hideous situations in Sudan, in Gaza, in all sorts of other places as well. But perhaps looking at it from a security point of view as well is absolutely counterproductive in terms of making the world a safer place. And therefore, what the British government is doing is cutting this aid in order to finance more weapons and more militarism, and to do so with some of the most jingoistic and right-wing policies. This is a very, very dangerous situation, where, as in Germany, we now have a far-right party which is in some polls ahead of the other two parties, and certainly is very, very close to the other two parties, and which will make gains from exactly the nationalism and the militarism on the one hand, but also the cuts in working class people's living standards, which will be an absolute certainty because it will not stop at overseas aid. It will also hit all sorts of other areas of public spending, including, although they say NHS is ring-fenced, the NHS will not be ring-fenced when it comes to the choice between that or militarism. And it's an absolute scandal that actually one of the problems that we have is the role of some of the unions, and particularly Unite made a statement saying that they supported the increase in arms spending. This is true of virtually all the parties in Parliament, including the more left-wing ones like the Greens, who say we don't want the overseas aid cut, but who are perfectly comfortable with the increase in arms spending. This is a very, very big problem for us. What are the conclusions that we can draw? Well, it seems to me that we've seen with the Palestine movement, which is a huge movement, that we do have a large number of people in Britain who want to organise and want to mobilise. I think it's important that we move the Palestine movement, which obviously has its own dynamic and will continue to be maintained, but which also needs to move towards opposing this military spending, opposing the cuts in people's living standards at the expense of the military, and therefore the welfare, not warfare slogan, I think, has to be absolutely central to everything that we do, and we have to make that much more central. And I think the other conclusion we have to draw is we cannot rely on governments in the Arab world. We cannot rely on the vast majority of the MPs in Parliament to do this for us. This has to come from below, and it means we have to be on the streets. And the final point I want to make about that is this, that protest has been under attack in this country, as it has been in the US and elsewhere, particularly in Germany, where there's a very vicious level of protest against Palestine protesters. We are committed to demonstrating and to organising and to defending the right to protest. We've had members of our movement who've been arrested and who are faced with charges. We are going to do everything that we can to defend them because we believe it is our democratic right to protest. We also believe the best way to fight back against this government and the policies it is following is to continue to mobilise, continue to organise. So I'd like to ask everybody to join Stop the War, to donate to Stop the War, to get resolutions through your trade union branch, to do everything that you can. We are in a very, very dangerous point in the world. We need all the solidarity, we need all the strength, and we need all the organisation that we can get. Thank you very much.